Hello and welcome to another episode of KARE 11 on the Record. I'm political reporter Danny Spiewak. We're just months away from Minnesota Republicans picking their next candidate for the governor's race in 2026. We've been sitting down with several candidates in recent weeks, and this week we talked with State Representative Kristin Robbins. Well, Representative, thank you for joining us here today at KARE 11. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with, of course, the precinct caucuses were this week, and you were fifth in the informal straw poll. What do you see as your path forward in this campaign in the Republican side for the GOP nomination?
Yeah, I've said from the beginning when I got in August that I'm going to stay in the race as long as I think I'm the best candidate to win the general election. We have often endorsed people who haven't won a general election, which is why it's been 20 years since Tim Pawlenty's reelect. And so we have to think about who's the best candidate who can go the distance to win the governor's race, not just get the endorsement. And I represent a purple district. So in my district, President Trump won by 0.4% and I won by 14 points. So those are the kinds of numbers we need if we're going to put together a winning statewide coalition.
President Trump, of course, has lost Minnesota 3 times. His approval ratings have declined since he took office in his second term. Would you seek an endorsement from him in this process as you're running for the seat?
I would certainly welcome the endorsement of the president. I don't know that he's getting involved in these kind of races, at least not this early, but anyone would want the president's endorsement.
Have you been supportive of his policies in general in his second term?
Generally, I'd say he's doing a really good job on getting the border closed. I mean, we were told it couldn't be done, and he did it relatively quickly. And I think a lot of what he's done to make trade more fair for our industries, especially returning manufacturing, has been really helpful. I think there's been many good things. The help that we're getting from the federal government to stop the fraud. I called for a full audit from the Federal Department of Human Services last July. And now we're finally getting that, as well as a lot of other resources from Treasury and the Small Business Administration. So on the fraud front, he's been terrific.
I'll certainly have a lot to ask you on the fraud side, since you're, of course, the head of the fraud committee in the House in Minnesota. When it comes to the crisis, though, that's ongoing with ICE and federal agents in Minnesota, do you believe that the Trump administration has acted in the right as they've come to Minnesota with this immigration enforcement?
I think it's been heartbreaking that 2 Minnesotans were killed, and truly we're grieving for their families, and I'm very sad about it. And what I've called from the very beginning, is that our federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies need to work together so that we do get the criminals off our streets. Federal immigration law is important and must be enforced. And even under President Obama, they had an ICE office in Hennepin County Jail so that we could honor these detainers and get the criminals off the streets so they didn't have to go hunt them down in the neighborhoods. And that's been the problem. I think the Walz administration and Mayor Frey wanted the chaos of the optics of ICE not being able to do their job and just get people off the streets from the jails, which is what they supported during the Obama administration. And so because ICE, in order to enforce the law, has to go into the neighborhoods, it's led to all this chaos, all these protests, and terribly the loss of life. So I'm heartened that they seem to be cooperating now. I think it really has mattered to tone it down, and that we're seeing a drawdown of some of the Border Patrol agents. So I'm very hopeful. But what we need from our leaders is cooperation across all levels of government so that we can end this chaos.
You've had some Republican members in the legislature who have expressed concerns about the conduct of the federal agents. There have been local law enforcement have alleged racial profiling. Is there any blame here that you place on the Trump administration for the events that have occurred?
So I would say if there has been misconduct by any Border Patrol or ICE official, it's on them, and they should be dealt with, and I believe they are being dealt with. I think Tom Homan was very clear that if people are inappropriately detaining people or profiling people or doing other things outside the bounds of their mission, that they will be dealt with in their process, which is the right thing to do. We need our law enforcement agents to fulfill their mission and abide by the law, and we need the public to do that. And when the public, it leads from constitutionally protected protesting, which I fully support, to obstructing, interfering, assaulting, or vandalizing, they also need to be dealt with. So it's both sides. And I'm optimistic that we are to a point where both are starting to cooperate more.
When it comes to the issue of fraud, which of course is intertwined with the Trump administration's reasoning for surging agents here in the first place, if you were governor, what would be some specific proposals and steps you would take to solve the fraud problem in Minnesota?
First of all, we'd have all new commissioners, all new deputy commissioners, assistant commissioners, and we would have a no fraud, no excuses culture. This has been allowed to happen because the Walz administration has turned a blind eye in the face of OLA reports, credible whistleblower reports that we've had for years. So we have got to say we are holding people accountable, and they will, if they're allowing this to happen on their watch, if they're not administering these programs correctly, they're gone. And if there is ability to prosecute under the malfeasance statute, we should do that, because we have to have a government that citizens have faith in. We have lost the trust of the citizens in how Minnesota government is run, which is terrible. But secondly, we would need to change a lot of the guardrails. So rather than rely on attestation, we would rely on documentation for eligibility for providers and for recipients. We would clean up the recipient roles, renew eligibility. We would have. Right now, they've always had the ability to stop payment for credible allegations of fraud or do prepayment reviews, but they weren't doing it. So we could standardize that and many other internal controls across state government, and that's how we're going to clean it up. But we need to get the public to have faith that we are doing our jobs.
Would you keep the fraud czar on staff that Governor Walz appointed a couple of months ago?
No, we need the independent Office of Inspector General that passed the Democrat-led Senate 60-7. Having a governor-appointed official, it's like the fox guarding the hen house. No, I would absolutely have an independent executive branch Inspector General.
Now, on your fraud committee in the Minnesota House, we've covered a lot of the hearings. Democrats on the committee have often criticized it, believing it's a political stunt. They've said that they don't believe that real legislation has been coming out of it. Do you believe that it's been effective as a vehicle for fighting fraud?
Absolutely. I think what we've seen is we've uncovered and exposed all these vectors of fraud, and we have passed legislation like the new whistleblower law, other ways to tighten internal controls. And we've kept the pressure on the agency officials to come in and explain what they're doing and why they're not doing their jobs. And so that pressure, I think, is what's led to all these federal investigations, and it's also led to the governor not running again. Like, we've had incredible success. Because of our pressure, we had the day before my adult daycare services hearing in December, they announced they were pausing new providers in adult day services. The day before my hearing on housing stabilization, they fired someone who had been running the housing stabilization program. So because we are keeping the pressure on, it's forcing the government to take action in the Walz administration that they wouldn't have otherwise taken, because they didn't take it for 7 years until our committee existed.
Of course, now, as you mentioned, the governor's not running for a third term, and Senator Klobuchar, who's won races by double digits for 4 terms in the Senate, is now running for governor. How does that messaging continue to work? She was an in-state government. She's been at the federal level. How does your messaging, how does it work with a new candidate now in the race?
I don't think it changes. She has never once called out Tim Walz and his administration for all this fraud. She supported him and has done nothing to stop fraud. I mean, most of these dollars are federal Medicaid dollars. She's done nothing to try to help close these gaps in internal controls at the federal level. She didn't even show up at the hearing yesterday. So I was at the hearing testifying in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and she's not a member of the subcommittee, which is what her staff is saying, but 3 other members who are not members of the subcommittee from the full committee were there. So, and if Tim Walz would have accepted the invitation, which he didn't, I'm sure she would have come to defend him, but she wasn't there to really hear the truth about what's going on in Minnesota. Very disappointing.
In this race, realistically, though, is she a beatable candidate? Republicans haven't won a statewide race in 2 decades in Minnesota.
So I think if we put up a candidate who is credible and can win in the suburbs and can keep a strong statewide margin, yes, because Minnesotans are fed up. Wherever I go in the state, people are so frustrated, not only with the billions in tax dollars that have been stolen, but as $9 billion has been stolen from our taxpayers, their taxes were raised $11 billion. And that still left us with a $6 billion deficit. So Minnesotans are incredibly frustrated. They need someone who's going to go in there and clean house in the executive branch. It's been 20 years since Republicans have had an executive leadership position in the governor's office, and that's built up 20 years of institutional malaise.
I'll ask you about a couple of other big issues that'll be upcoming in the session and then on the campaign as well. Democrats in the House, your colleagues, are going to bring in an assault weapons ban proposal again. Would you support that in the wake of Annunciation Church?
I'm sorry, weapons ban at the Capitol?
Yes, if you were, let's say you were governor, let's say you were elected, would you support any type of assault weapons ban, or even as a legislator here in the upcoming session, will you support one?
No, there was an assault weapons ban nationally for 10 years, and what the data shows is that it didn't move the needle on violent crime. People just found a way around the definition of what an assault weapons ban was, and they bought those other guns. It didn't actually change it. Well, the criminals will always find a way to get the gun. What we need is to enforce the law, and we need to make sure that criminals do not have access to guns. We need to strengthen the law about straw purchasing. I've worked on that for years. From my freshman year, I had a bill on that working with the ATF. We need to increase penalties for violent crimes and straw purchases, and that's how we will crack down on this.
Another issue that was really big in the 2022 campaign, of course, was abortion rights. As a governor, would you sign any bill that would restrict the rights that are currently on the books in Minnesota?
I mean, it's really hard to answer a broad hypothetical like that, so I can't imagine, there's so many nuances. But what I will say is that I think I'm pro-life. And I represent what is probably a pro-choice district. And when I talk to friends who are pro-life or pro-choice, what we find is people all across the spectrum want to reduce the number of abortions. So I would work with people on both sides of the aisle to find ways to reduce the number of abortions. And we had things that were legal under Roe in Minnesota on the books that Democrats got rid of. So I think that's the best place to start. Having parental notification, tracking the data, funding support for crisis pregnancy centers where you're supporting the woman and the baby. Those were common sense things that Minnesota used to have that the Democrats got rid of. So I think we can find ways that we want to work together to reduce the number of abortions.
But you believe the state Supreme Court decision is settled law. I know some other candidates have said that basically that this isn't something they would try to touch.
So settled law is an interesting term. I think definitely it's a strong decision, and the current makeup of the court would not support overturning it. So I don't like to think about hypotheticals, but it would be a tough road, and the current makeup of the court would never support it.
When it comes to the campaign, I know for viewers that are unfamiliar, traditionally Republicans in Minnesota have abided by the endorsement process and not necessarily the primary through voters. Would you abide by the endorsement? Would you, in other words, would you try to run in a primary if the party doesn't choose you?
Yes, I've said from the beginning, I plan to stay in the race as long as I think I'm the best person to win the general election. The endorsement matters. I come from the grassroots. I've been a precinct captain. I've done all the BPOU leadership work for years, well before I was elected. But that being said, the candidate that generally has been endorsed over the last 20 years has not been able to win in a general. And the prize is winning the general, not winning the endorsement.
So you would go on to a primary?
Yes, as long as I think I'm the best candidate to win.
Okay. Representative, thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you.